wind hit the cabin walls like a pack of wolves in the dark. It shoved at the logs, slipped through narrow seams, and made the whole prairie groan under the weight of coming winter. But inside one small cabin on a rise above the river, the air stayed soft and even. Warmth touched all four corners of the room, not just the space near the fire. And in the middle of that room stood the very thing the neighbors had laughed at for months. A fireplace. Not against the wall, not at the end of the cabin. Right in the center, where no sensible settler would ever put it. So how did the strangest idea in the whole settlement become the one thing that kept the cold from winning? The year before that hard winter, when the grass still stood tall and green over the Kansas prairie, a man named Silas Mercer came west with a plain wagon, 2 oxen, and a habit of watching before speaking. He was not loud like some men. He did not boast about what he knew, but he had seen more winters than most of the settlers along Cottonwood Creek, and he carried that knowledge the way a blacksmith carried a hammer. Quietly, with purpose. The spring of 1855 had turned the settlement into a race against time. Cabins had to go up before the first deep cold. Men cut logs from creek bottoms, dragged stone from open ground, and raised walls as fast as their backs and hands would allow. Most followed the same method. Lay out a narrow cabin, raise the walls quick, leave one end open for a chimney built along the outside. It was the way many had done it before. It was quick. It was familiar. Out here, familiar often passed for wise. Silas did not join the rush at once. Instead, he walked the land for 3 days. He studied the slope above the creek. He watched where the morning frost clung longest. He stood in the wind and let it tell him how it crossed the open prairie. He noticed where the ground stayed dry after a rain and where the cold air seemed to settle low at dusk. Only after that did he choose a spot on a small rise above the water where the wind still came hard, but the cold did not sink and sit. The first surprise came when he marked out his cabin. It was bigger than most men expected, 20 feet by 24, wide enough to breathe in, wide enough to live in through a long winter. A few settlers glanced over from their own work and muttered to each other. Space cost time. Time cost safety. But the real shock came when Silas stepped into the center of that marked ground and drove 4 stakes into the earth. A square, 6 feet by 6 feet, right in the middle of what would become his one-room cabin. Men stopped swinging axes. 1 or 2 laughed before they even knew what they were looking at. The loudest voice belonged to Boone Kessler, a thick-shouldered settler from Missouri, whose hands were hard with old labor and whose words often came out before his thoughts. He leaned on his axe handle and squinted toward the stakes. "You fixing to build around a tree stump you can't pull?" he called. A few men laughed harder at that. Silas wiped his brow with the back of his wrist and looked up. "No," he said. "That's where the chimney goes." Boone frowned. "The chimney?" "In the center." That drew more laughter than the first joke had. One man slapped his knee. Another shook his head and said Silas must have lost good sense somewhere east of the Mississippi. On the frontier, every foot of floor space mattered. A cabin was where you cooked, slept, dried clothes, stored tools, and kept your family alive. To give the middle of it over to stone seemed foolish beyond reason. Boone walked closer and planted the end of his axe handle in the dirt. "You ain't building a house," he said. "You're building a monument." Silas only smiled a little. He explained it once, plain and simple. Back in Vermont, where he had grown up, his father's house had a great stone chimney in the middle. 4 sides of the house gathered around it. In winter, they burned a hot fire before night, and the stone held that warmth for hours after the flames sank low. The heat stayed in the house because the stone stayed in the house. "Masonry outside warms the wind," Silas said. "Masonry inside warms the people." The men were not impressed. Out here, men trusted what they had done before. They trusted speed, not theory. A chimney on the outer wall took less stone, less labor, less time. Silas's plan would eat up all 3. By the time others had walls up and roofs on, he would still be hauling rock like a man trying to build a courthouse. Still, he kept going. He dug the center footing deep and packed the earth firm. Then he began hauling fieldstone from the prairie. Some rocks were easy enough to carry in both arms. Others took all his strength and a handcart to move. Day after day, he fitted them into place, building a square base that rose from the ground slow and stubborn. The pile grew higher, then broader, then heavier. By the time the walls of neighboring cabins were already standing, Silas was still setting stone. 5 tons, maybe more. Men passing by would stop just to stare. Boone came more than once. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he only shook his head. "You'll freeze while you're still building," he said one afternoon. Silas set another stone in place. "Then I'd better build it right." By late summer, the chimney began to show its full shape. It rose thick and solid from the center of the cabin floor. One hearth opening faced the front half of the room, wide enough for strong oak logs. Another smaller opening faced the back, where a cook table and bed space would stand. 2 flues climbed together inside the same stone body. The whole thing looked less like a fireplace and more like the heart of some strange little fortress. And it did exactly what the neighbors feared most. It ruled the room. No man could walk from one side to the other without going around it. No woman could sweep the floor in a straight line. No child would ever run across that cabin without circling stone. Boone pointed that out with great pleasure. "Well," he said, standing in the doorway one evening, "at least when winter kills us all, folks will remember where your floor space went." Silas gave no answer. He was kneeling by the hearth, running his hand over the stone as if listening to it. By early October, the cabin was finished. The log walls stood tight. The roof held firm. The great chimney sat in the middle of the room, heavy and still, like it had always belonged there. Outside, the prairie grass had turned pale. The mornings came colder. Frost began to silver the ground before sunrise. Smoke started rising from cabins all through the settlement. Then, on the night of October 15th, the first hard cold came down from the north. Families lit their first serious fires. Wind rattled shutters and pushed sharp air through cracks in green timber. In cabin after cabin, settlers fed flames and watched the corners darken with cold. Inside his own cabin, Silas Mercer built a different kind of fire. Not a slow one. Not a careful one meant to last until dawn. He built it hot. Oak snapped. Hickory popped. Flames climbed high against the stone throat of the hearth. For 2 full hours, he fed the blaze until the face of the chimney turned too warm to touch. Heat sank into the deep stone the way rain sinks into dry earth. Then, just as the cold outside thickened, Silas stopped adding wood. He let the fire settle low. That was when the real test began. The wind stayed sharp all night, scraping across the prairie and pressing its cold hands against every cabin along Cottonwood Creek. In most homes, sleep came broken. Men had to rise from their beds to feed the fire. Women pulled extra quilts over children already curled close to the hearth. In the far corners of those cabins, darkness held the cold like a living thing. But inside Silas Mercer's cabin, the flames sank low and the warmth did not leave. He woke before dawn and lit a lantern. The room was quiet except for the faint hiss of the coals and the low cry of wind outside. He crossed the floor barefoot, slow and careful, and set the lantern on a shelf. Then he touched the stone face of the chimney. It was still warm, not just near the firebox, not just on one side, warm all around. Silas gave a small nod to himself. He did not smile much, but something easy moved across his face then. The stone had done what he knew it would do. It had taken the evening fire deep into its body and was now giving that heat back to the room, slow and steady, through the long cold hours before dawn. He checked the small thermometer he kept on a wooden peg near the bed. The room still held at 56 degrees. Outside, frost lay white over the grass. At nearly the same hour, Boone Kessler stood in his own cabin with a blanket around his shoulders and a curse caught in his teeth. He had fed his fire twice during the night, yet the far end of the room still bit with cold. A tin dipper left beside the wall had a rim of ice on it. One of his boys slept with his boots still on because his feet had gone numb before midnight. Boone stared at his hearth and then at the wall behind it. Half his chimney sat outside in the dark wind, just as frontier builders said it should. Safe from sparks, safe from fire climbing the logs. But the stone outside had turned cold as river ice, and that cold passed straight through the masonry into the cabin. His fire was not only fighting the winter, it was fighting the chimney too. By sunrise, the difference between Boone's cabin and Silas's was already becoming a thing people talked about in low voices. The settlement was still too proud to admit much after one cold night, but men noticed what they noticed. Smoke had risen from Boone's roof more than once before dawn. Silas's had not. That evening, 2 neighbors stopped by Silas's place under the excuse of borrowing a draw knife. They came in stamping dirt from their boots and fell quiet almost at once. The fire in the hearth was not large. The room, though, felt even and mild. Warmth reached the doorway. Warmth rested along the back wall. Warmth touched the sleeping corner without anyone having to drag a bed close to the flames. One of the men looked toward the chimney and then toward Silas. "It's the stone, then," he said. Silas poured coffee into a tin cup. "It's where the stone sits." They stood there longer than they needed to. Men on the frontier rarely admitted wonder, but both of them kept drifting toward the far side of the room, as if checking whether the warmth really reached there too. It did. As October passed, the pattern repeated itself night after night. Silas built one hard evening fire. He let the stone drink the heat. Then he let the flames fall. While others rose from bed in darkness to toss on more wood, Silas slept. The proof showed in more than comfort. His woodpile shrank slowly. Other men had started their winter stacks with strong pride, neat rows of split oak and elm set beside their cabins. By the end of the month, some were already shocked by how much they had burned. A cold cabin made hungry demands. Heat vanished fast when half a chimney stood outside under the sky. Wood that should have lasted through deep winter began disappearing in long, steady bites. Silas noticed it when he passed by the yards. He said nothing. Pride was still standing guard in the settlement. But Dr. Amos Reed noticed too, and he was not a man who kept his thoughts to himself. Reed rode between scattered homes and camps all through the territory. He had seen enough winter sickness to know how much a house could shape a family's health. One afternoon, after tending a fevered child in a cabin down by the creek, he stepped into Silas's home on his way back and paused in the doorway. "Well now," he said softly. The doctor took off his gloves, looked around, and felt the warmth with the care of a man measuring more than comfort. He moved from one side of the room to the other. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small thermometer. He checked near the door, then near the bed, then beside the table. The numbers stayed close. "A man could keep children well in a room like this," Reed said. Silas pushed another stick into the fire. "That's the hope." After that, the doctor began paying closer attention during his rounds. In cabins with end chimneys, the same trouble kept showing itself. The hearth side stayed livable. The far corners turned raw and damp with cold. Children coughed more. Wet socks and gloves took too long to dry. Sleep came poorly because someone always had to mind the fire. In Silas's cabin, the air stayed drier. Blankets stayed warm longer. A coat hung near the chimney could dry all the way through by morning. Reed began speaking of it out loud to anyone willing to listen. The settlement listened, but not all with the same heart. Boone Kessler still fought the idea every chance he got. He stood outside the trading shed one windy afternoon sharpening his axe while two other men talked about Silas's chimney. "It's been cool weather," Boone said. "That ain't winter. Wait till January. Wait till a real storm tears through this place. Then we'll see if that big rock pile is worth giving up half a room." One of the men nodded because Boone had lived hard and spoken hard for many years. His voice still carried weight, but the nod came slower than it would have a month before. By early November, people had started looking toward Silas's cabin with something more than curiosity. Women asked quiet questions about where he had learned to build that way. Men pretended they only cared about the size of the foundation or the draw of the flues, but their eyes told a different story. They were thinking about their own walls, their own children, their own wood piles. Silas answered when asked. He even showed one young couple how the chimney's mass held heat after the fire dropped low. He spoke without pride and without revenge, though he had every right to remember the laughter from summer. That was the part some people understood last. He had not built the chimney to prove anyone foolish. He had built it because winter did not care about pride, and the prairie showed mercy to no one. Then November deepened. The grass turned brittle. The creek edges stiffened with ice. The geese vanished from the sky. And one evening, just before dark, Silas stood outside his cabin and felt the wind change. It came harder from the north, sharper. He lifted his eyes across the open land and saw the sky settling into a flat gray lid. Old snowlight, stormlight, the kind that made a man think about doors, blankets, and wood. Behind him, from cabins across the settlement, smoke already climbed into the bitter air. Silas looked once at his woodpile, then at the heavy stone chimney waiting inside. The real winter had not yet arrived, but it was close enough now that a man could hear it coming. The true test came in January. All day on the 10th, the sky hung low over the prairie, heavy and mean. By late afternoon, the light had turned thin and colorless. The wind shifted hard out of the north and began to rise. Men who had lived long enough on open land knew that kind of wind. It came before the worst cold. It came before the prairie tried to break a person. By sundown, every family along Cottonwood Creek had barred doors, checked blankets, and stacked wood by the hearth. Inside his cabin, Silas Mercer did what he had done all season. but this time he did it with more care. He built the fire hotter than usual. Thick oak caught fast. The flames climbed high and bright, filling the hearth with a hard orange glow. The face of the chimney took on that deep firelight color, warm and steady, like a living thing. For hours, Silas fed the blaze and let the great stone heart of the cabin drink in every bit of heat it could hold. Outside, the first snow began to race sideways through the dark. By midnight, the storm was in full force. Wind screamed across the prairie with nothing to stop it. Snow lifted from the ground and flew like white dust through the night. The temperature fell past 0. Cabin walls groaned, roofs shuddered. In some homes, frost began creeping over the inside edges of window cloth and along the seams between logs. In Boone Kessler's cabin, the fire never stopped burning, yet the room still felt under attack. Boone and his wife took turns waking to feed more wood into the flames. Each time the fire dropped, the cold pushed farther in. The outer half of the chimney stood in the storm, and the stone turned bitter with outside cold. Boone laid his palm against the inner face of the masonry and jerked it back. It felt like cold leaking through a grave wall. His youngest boy, Caleb, slept wrapped in 2 quilts with his feet toward the hearth. Even so, he shivered in his sleep. Boone's wife pulled the blanket tighter around him and looked at her husband with fear she did not try to hide. In cabin after cabin, the same struggle played out. Men rose from their beds all through the night. Women held children close. Water pails crusted with ice. Breath drifted in the air. Families burned wood as if throwing it into a hole. But on the rise above the creek, Silas Mercer let his fire burn down. By midnight, only a bed of red coals remained. The heat came from the stone now. The great chimney stood in the center of the room, giving back what it had gathered through the evening. Warmth moved away from it in every direction. It reached the table. It reached the bed. It reached the far wall and the door. The air did not feel sharp anywhere. The whole room held together under that quiet, steady heat. Before dawn, Silas woke and checked the thermometer by lantern light. 56 degrees. He walked to the entry and held the lantern low. Even there, near the door, the air felt mild. He moved to the sleeping corner, still warm. He touched the chimney on the side farthest from the firebox. The stone held heat deep in its body, not just at the surface. It was doing the work of a dozen small flames without noise, without smoke, without waste. Then a pounding came at the door. Silas opened it against the wind. Boone Kessler stood there with snow crusted in his beard, his eyes raw from cold and pride both. Behind him, his wife held Caleb wrapped in quilts, and 2 other children pressed close at her sides. The boy's cheeks were white in spots. So were the tips of 2 fingers that showed through the blanket. For a second, Boone said nothing. The storm howled behind him. Then he swallowed hard and spoke. "My boy's starting to freeze." Silas stepped aside at once. "Get in." Boone's family stumbled through the doorway. The children looked around with that stunned, quiet look people get when they move from danger into safety too fast to believe it. Boone's wife carried Caleb to the back corner of the cabin, then stopped and blinked as if she could not understand what she felt. It was warm there, not just by the fire, not only near the stone, warm in the corner. She sat down and laid the boy across her lap. The children slowly loosened their blankets. Boone stood near the door, snow melting off his coat onto the floorboards, unable for a moment to meet Silas's eyes. Silas crouched beside Caleb and checked his hands and face in the lantern glow. "He'll be all right," he said. "You got here in time." Boone let out a breath that seemed to leave his whole body at once. By morning, word had spread through the storm. One family came first, then another. A widow from a cabin near the creek arrived with her little girl wrapped in a shawl. A young couple came with a baby tucked under a buffalo robe. Through that bitter day and the night after, Silas's cabin became the one place people spoke of in the same breath as shelter. The chimney they had mocked all summer now warmed more than one family. Children slept in every corner of the room. Coats and mittens hung near the stone and dried through. The fire itself did not need to roar. The chimney carried the warmth where it was needed. While other cabins fought the cold with constant flames and shrinking wood piles, Silas used less wood and held more heat. Every stone in that great center stack gave its strength to the people inside instead of to the wind outside. Boone saw it all with his own eyes. He watched his children sleep without shivering. He stood in the far corner and felt warmth there, real warmth, where his own cabin held only cold. He watched Silas feed the fire once, then let the stone do the rest. Pride did not leave Boone easily, but during that storm it began to break apart piece by piece. When the weather finally eased and the sky cleared, families returned to their own homes, changed in ways that did not show on the surface at first. The settlement had survived, but not without cost. Chinking had split in walls. Doors had swelled and twisted. Wood stacks had fallen low. Faces looked worn from too many nights with too little sleep. Silas's cabin stood steady on the rise. Inside, the wood remained dry. Tools had not frozen. His remaining firewood stack was still higher than most men thought possible for that point in winter. The chimney had not only held heat, it had protected the whole life of the cabin. By early spring, men had begun asking him questions without mockery in their voices. How deep had he laid the footing? How thick was the stone at the core? How had he set the flues so the draw stayed clean? Silas answered each question plainly. He showed what he knew the same way he had built the chimney itself, with patience and no need to boast. That following summer, more than one new cabin rose in the settlement, with its chimney drawn closer to the center. Some men could not rebuild from scratch, but they changed what they could. They added walls around existing stone stacks. They studied heat the way they had once only studied speed. And Boone Kessler, who had laughed the loudest, was the man who told the story most often after that. He told it at wagon camps. He told it at timber cuttings. He told it to men new to the territory who thought a house was just walls and a roof and a place for fire. He always ended the same way, shaking his head a little at himself. "Thought that fool gave up the middle of his cabin for nothing," he would say. Turns out, he gave the whole room a fighting chance. Years later, people still remembered that hard Kansas winter, the one that pressed frost into blankets and made the prairie sound like it wanted every soul on it gone. But they remembered something else, too. They remembered the strange fireplace standing in the middle of Silas Mercer's cabin, the one they had laughed at when the grass was green and the days were easy. Because when the real cold came, that foolish-looking chimney heated all four corners of the room, and quietly, without asking for praise, it proved that the smartest idea is sometimes the one that looks wrong until the day it saves you. If you believe stories still matter, go ahead and hit subscribe, Stories Beyond the Porch. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thanks for watching.